Step away from the vehicle now. Hands up where I can see them.
Officer, relax. I'm loading training kits and policy binders
Don't
for
talk.
a community meeting.
Step back. Who authorized you to be in this bay?
I did. I'm Assistant Chief Darnell Price. My credentials are right here. I'm going to hold them steady so you can read them.
That's fake. People flash fake ID.
In the restricted evidence transfer bay behind Raleigh Police Headquarters, Officer Trevor Klein moved fast and loud, like he needed everyone within earshot to understand he was in control. He'd spotted a man at an unmarked department SUV loading sealed materials into the back. From a distance, Klein decided he was watching a theft in progress. He didn't pause to verify access. He didn't start with procedure. He came in hot. He ordered the man to step away from the vehicle. He closed distance quickly. He used that sharp public tone officers use when they wanted compliance first and questions later. The man didn't flinch. He stayed calm and tried to show credentials. Klein refused to even really look, calling them fake and insisting people tried that move all the time. He treated the badge wallet like a prop and doubled down on the confrontation. And that's when the man asked for one simple thing. Something so reasonable, it should have ended the entire situation in seconds. He directed Klein to radio a supervisor and verify the plate assignment. Klein finally keyed his radio. Dispatch confirmed the SUV was assigned to command staff. The name attached matched the man standing there. That should have been the end. But Klein didn't back off. He kept pushing anyway, as if the verification didn't count, as if reality was negotiable. It wasn't panic anymore. It was ego refusing to lose in front of an audience. Then the evidence transfer bay door opened again. A veteran sergeant walked in, took one look at the man Klein was trying to bully, and froze, because he recognized him instantly. And because the sergeant understood something Klein hadn't fully processed yet. The entire exchange had been captured by a fixed bay camera, and Klein's body cam had been turned on late, but not late enough. The scene stopped being a misunderstanding in a restricted area. It became a documented test of the department's culture, recorded from multiple angles, with no room for creative rewriting later. Where are you watching from? Country, state, or city? Drop it in the comments. And if you like story times where calm professionalism meets accountability and cameras make the truth unavoidable, hit like and subscribe. Rewind. Assistant Chief Darnell Price had been newly appointed. Black, respected, and known for staying steady under pressure, he was on a tight schedule that morning. He had a community meeting coming up, and he needed to load sealed training kits and policy binders, materials meant for that meeting, into his unmarked department SUV. The evidence transfer bay was restricted for a reason. It was controlled space, documented space. It wasn't the kind of place where guesses were supposed to replace verification, but Officer Trevor Klein had been assigned to security for property and evidence transport, one of those routine enforcement roles where a person could either learn discipline and restraint or turn authority into a personal weapon. Klein saw Price from a distance and assumed suspect before he confirmed staff. And once he committed to that assumption publicly, he couldn't accept the fastest off-ramp procedure. So even after dispatch confirmed the plate and the name, Klein kept trying to force the moment to end with him winning. That's what made what happened next so important, because the veteran sergeant who walked in wasn't just a witness. He was the first person in that bay who understood how far this was about to go. The veteran sergeant didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He stepped fully into the bay, looked from Klein to the man by the SUV, and the pause said everything. This wasn't some random person near a vehicle. This was Assistant Chief Darnell Price, and Klein was still acting like he had caught a thief. Price stayed calm and let the facts stay in control. He didn't posture, he didn't threaten. He repeated the same point he'd already made. The vehicle assignment had been verified, and the materials he was loading were sealed training kits and policy binders for a community meeting. Klein heard it, but he couldn't accept it, because by then the situation wasn't about safety. It was about Klein refusing to back down in front of witnesses and a camera he'd forgotten existed until it mattered. He tried to justify his behavior as doing his job, even though the job had an obvious procedure. verify before escalating. And the worst part for him was that verification had already happened. Dispatch had confirmed the plate was assigned to command staff, and the name matched. In a normal professional encounter, that's where you reset, apologize, and move on. Klein didn't reset. He kept talking like the confirmation didn't count, like the credentials didn't count, like Price's calm didn't count. The sergeant watched it happen with the kind of expression that came from experience, because he understood the chain reaction this creates inside a department. Then the sergeant did what Klein should have done first. He took control of the scene with procedure. He directed Klein to stand down. He addressed Price respectfully. He asked one more time for the basic verification points. Not because he doubted Price, but because he was building a clean, professional record on the spot. And Price gave it quietly, clearly. Now the situation had 3 layers of proof. The restricted bay's fixed camera, Klein's body cam, late but active during the crucial minutes, and the radio dispatch log confirming the plate and assignment. Klein had no room left to claim confusion. What he had left was attitude. And that attitude, captured in a restricted area with oversight cameras, turned this from a mistake into a question people inside the building couldn't dodge. How did an officer feel comfortable treating someone like this after verification? That's where the culture issues surfaced. Because this wasn't just Klein being jumpy. This was a young officer in a control-oriented assignment, treating enforcement like confrontation, assuming suspect first, dismissing credentials, and then refusing to accept confirmed facts. The sergeant didn't debate him. He didn't lecture on the spot. He did the thing that makes accountability real in modern policing. He ensured the footage and the reports would reach the people who couldn't ignore them. Price didn't demand special treatment. He didn't need to. The evidence did the demanding. By the time Price left the bay to head to the community meeting, the incident was already bigger than the 2 of them. Not because anyone had posted it online yet, because inside that building, the right people now knew there was a recorded confrontation involving command staff that never should have happened in the first place. And if it could happen to a man with credentials, access, and authority, everyone understood what that implied for people who had none. Once Price left for the community meeting, the department moved into damage control mode, but not the public kind, the internal kind. Because this wasn't a complaint from a stranger, it was a recorded confrontation in a restricted bay involving command staff, verified dispatch information, and an officer who still refused to stand down. That meant supervisors couldn't minimize it without implicating themselves. Internal affairs locked down the footage quickly. The fixed bay camera was secured. Klein's body cam was pulled and flagged. Radio traffic and dispatch logs were preserved. The goal was simple. No editing, no missing files, no convenient gaps. And as soon as the clips were reviewed together, the story changed shape. It wasn't just that Klein approached aggressively. It was that he dismissed credentials, got verification, and still kept pressing, like facts were optional if they conflicted with his assumption. That's the point where it stops looking like a training issue and starts looking like a culture issue. So investigators did what they always do when a clean incident exposes a bigger problem. They pulled history. They reviewed prior complaints tied to Klein's assignment area. They looked at how evidence bay officers were trained, what they were told to do before escalating, who supervised them, what verify first actually meant in practice. They checked whether similar confrontations had been written off as routine enforcement because the targets didn't have rank, connections, or credibility inside the building. And more things started lining up. Not necessarily identical incidents, but the same pattern: aggressive approach, fast suspicion, refusal to accept explanations, and reports that framed confrontation as good police work. The evidence bay role, which should have been about careful procedure, had become a place where certain personalities could turn authority into harassment. That's why leadership couldn't treat it as one bad moment. The problem wasn't only what Klein did, it was how easy it had been for him to do it, confidently, publicly, in a restricted space, while cameras rolled. Klein was suspended. Then the termination process began. The department couldn't keep him in that role, and after the footage, they couldn't keep him in the department without inviting a bigger fight. But Price didn't stop at discipline. He pushed for changes that made it harder for the next Klein to do the same thing. Mandatory verification steps before any enforcement action in restricted areas. Clear supervision requirements for evidence bay officers. Documentation standards that couldn't be optional. And critically, public reporting of profiling complaints so the department couldn't pretend patterns didn't exist until they were caught on camera. On the city side, a civil rights claim followed, and the city settled, because the documentation made denial expensive. And that's where the story landed for everyone watching inside and outside the department. If an assistant chief with credentials, plate verification, and command authority could still be treated like a suspect, what happened to regular citizens who had none of that protection? What made the fallout different wasn't just that Klein got suspended and fired. It was what the footage forced everyone to admit out loud. Verification had worked, and he ignored it anyway. So Price treated it like a leadership problem, not a personal insult. He didn't chase revenge. He pushed the department to close the exact gaps Klein had used. Because if those gaps stayed open, the next incident would happen to someone without rank, and it would be easier to bury. The new rules were simple and hard to argue with. In restricted areas like the evidence transfer bay, officers had to complete mandatory verification steps before any enforcement action: plate check, access confirmation, supervisor notification. Evidence-based security could no longer operate like a solo power zone. Supervision rules tightened, so a young officer couldn't escalate unchecked. Profiling complaints and outcomes had to be tracked and publicly reported, so patterns couldn't be dismissed as isolated. The city settled the civil rights claim because the documentation made the risk obvious. But the settlement wasn't the real weight of the story. The real weight was what it proved. This happened to command staff with credentials, access, and verification on record. So the question that hung over Raleigh afterward, and the one Price didn't let anyone dodge, was the same one that hit the community immediately. If it could happen to him, what happened to people with no badge wallet, no title, and no one inside the building who recognized their face? Once the policy changes were announced, the department tried to frame the incident as a one-off that had been handled. But inside the building, people knew better because the footage didn't show confusion. It showed a refusal to accept verification. That's why the reforms mattered. They weren't cosmetic. They were designed to remove the exact moments where bias and ego could hide behind "I thought" or "I felt." Price also made sure the message internally was just as clear as the policy externally. Restricted areas were not places for improvisation. The job was procedure. If an officer couldn't follow verification steps, they didn't belong in that assignment. For the public, the case became a reference point, not because it was dramatic, but because it was clean. A calm command staff member, a young officer escalating, dispatch confirming the truth, the officer still refusing to back down, cameras capturing the whole sequence. The city settlement closed the legal chapter, but it didn't erase the question the footage left behind. If someone at Price's level could be treated like that even with credentials and confirmed plate assignment, then the protection regular residents assumed existed was thinner than they wanted to believe. And that's where the story ends, right on that uncomfortable truth. Accountability didn't happen because the system was naturally fair. It happened because the system was forced to face evidence. So, what would you have done in that bay if you were Price, calm but being pushed? And what would you do as a witness, knowing a camera can be the difference between a claim and a fact? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more story times like this, grounded, realistic, and focused on accountability, make sure you subscribe.
Ma'am, I need to step inside, now.
Officer, I'm Judge Alana Whitaker. You do not have consent to enter. Do you have a warrant?
This is an investigation. We can do this the easy way.
The easy way is you staying off my threshold without a warrant.
Officer Derek Halverson stood on a quiet Maplewood porch with his shoulders squared and his voice raised, like the badge was a key. He insisted he needed to come inside immediately. He framed it as urgent police business, the kind of urgency meant to make people step aside without thinking. He added pressure in the same breath, consequences, obstruction talk, the usual intimidation moves. The homeowner didn't step back. She stayed calm, held her ground, and did something that made Halverson's confidence flicker for half a second, like he'd just realized the situation wasn't going to follow his script. Then a small detail changed everything. A phone camera light appeared across the street. Another angle followed from farther down. Quietly, without anyone shouting or intervening, the whole scene started getting recorded. Clean, time-stamped, impossible to misremember later. Halverson noticed, and his face changed in a way that told you he wasn't worried about danger inside the house anymore. He was worried about what he'd already done on the porch, because whatever he'd walked up there planning, it suddenly looked like he had picked the worst possible door in Maplewood to try it on. Where are you watching from? Country, state, or city? Drop it in the comments. And if you like story times, where intimidation meets calm boundaries and accountability actually kicks in, hit like and subscribe. Rewind a few minutes. In Maplewood, Halverson had built a reputation people didn't say out loud, unless they trusted who was listening. Residents described him as the kind of officer who leaned on fear, especially with black residents, using threats and presence to force compliance first and justify it later. That night he arrived on a residential street, claiming he was working a narcotics investigation. He treated the urgency like it was evidence. He demanded entry as if paperwork was optional. But the homeowner didn't respond like someone caught off guard. She stayed measured and procedural, refusing to be rushed into surrendering rights. And while Halverson tried different pressure tactics, stepping closer, talking louder, implying consequences, something else was happening around them. The neighborhood was paying attention. Two neighbors recorded from different angles. The homeowner recorded too. No chaos, no crowd, just documentation. And in a moment like that, documentation became the real authority. Halverson could feel it. The porch had turned into a record. Every word, every threat, every step forward was now something that could be reviewed later by people who didn't accept "because I said so" as an explanation. That was when the final piece landed. Something about the homeowner that Halverson clearly hadn't anticipated when he came up the walkway. His posture shifted again, sharper this time. Like a person realizing he wasn't the one putting someone on the spot. He was the one being tested. Halverson tried to recover control the way officers like him usually did, by doubling down. He kept the pressure on, leaning into urgency and authority, acting like the homeowner was the obstacle instead of his lack of legal paperwork. He pushed the idea that refusing him would look bad, that cooperation was the safer choice, that he could make the situation harder if she kept saying no. But the homeowner stayed steady and procedural. She didn't argue feelings. She didn't match his volume. She kept the issue narrow. Without a warrant, he had no legal right to enter. And with each repeated demand from Halverson, the recordings became more valuable. Because intimidation only works when it disappears afterward. Here it wasn't disappearing. Two neighbors kept filming from different angles, and the homeowner's own recording captured his tone and her calm refusal in a clean timeline. That meant if Halverson later tried to rewrite the story, claim consent, claim a threat, claim something in plain view, there would be receipts. That's when Halverson made his first real mistake. He let frustration show. Not a dramatic explosion, just enough to reveal what was underneath the Investigation Act. An officer used to people folding, suddenly facing someone who wouldn't. The mask slipped in a way cameras love. Subtle, clear, and impossible to explain away. Then the turning point hit. The homeowner identified herself clearly as Judge Alana Whitaker, a U.S. federal judge. You could feel the power shift without anyone needing to shout. Halverson didn't suddenly become polite. because he respected the law. He recalculated because he understood consequences. A federal judge meant oversight. It meant credibility. It meant his body cam footage wouldn't just stay inside a department drawer. It meant his "I felt threatened" shortcut wouldn't land the way it sometimes did. And he knew he was still standing there with no warrant. So he backed down. Not with an apology. Not with accountability in the moment. More like a retreat. Pulling his demands back. Stepping away from the door. Ending the confrontation before it became a career-ending clip. He walked off the porch and left. The neighbors kept recording until he was gone, because that's what people did now when they'd seen too much go unchecked. They made sure the ending was captured, too. And that night, the story didn't stay on the street. The footage moved quickly, shared in neighborhood groups, sent to local contacts, forwarded to people who knew how complaints actually got processed. The same night, formal complaints were filed. Not vague ones. Specific ones. Timestamps, multiple angles, officer name, narrative consistent across recordings, which meant the department couldn't handle it the old way. They couldn't call it "he said, she said." They couldn't quietly dismiss it as a misunderstanding, because it wasn't just a resident's word this time. It was documented conduct with witnesses and a homeowner whose professional role made the stakes impossible to ignore. By the next morning, the department had a problem it couldn't downplay. This wasn't a messy story with conflicting accounts. It was clean footage from multiple angles, time-stamped, showing an officer claiming urgency, demanding entry without a warrant, and trying to pressure a homeowner into giving up rights. The body cam and dispatch logs would either match the story or expose it further. Either way, there was no easy way to bury it. And because the homeowner was a federal judge, the usual slow walk tactics didn't make sense. The complaint wasn't going to get lost. The questions weren't going to be brushed off. The department had to respond like it expected scrutiny, because it did. Internal reviews started fast. Supervisors pulled Halverson's reports and compared them to what the cameras showed. They checked whether there had actually been a narcotics operation tied to that address. They checked whether he'd been sent there or whether he'd freelanced it. They looked at how he described the encounter afterward, because that's where patterns usually show up. What an officer claimed versus what evidence supported. Then the bigger issue surfaced. Once investigators started digging, the porch incident didn't stay isolated. Complaints that had previously been treated as unproven suddenly looked different when placed next to documented behavior. Stops that residents said felt targeted. Searches residents said felt coerced. Encounters where intimidation did the work that procedure was supposed to do. The review turned from one bad call into repeat behavior. And at that point, the department had two choices: protect the officer and own the scandal, or act like a department that understood liability, trust, and oversight. So Halverson was suspended and put under investigation, not as a symbolic move, but as a necessary one, because the evidence created a risk the department could measure: civil exposure, internal policy violations, and a public record that made "we didn't know" impossible to say with a straight face. For the community, the shift was immediate. People who'd been afraid to complain before saw what documentation could do when it was clear and consistent. The story became a reference point, not gotcha content, but proof that calm boundaries plus recording could stop intimidation before it became something worse. And Judge Whitaker didn't have to give speeches or go on TV to make the point. Her role in the story worked like a spotlight. It showed exactly how an officer behaved when he assumed a resident had no power, and how quickly he changed when he realized the opposite was true. Halverson's career didn't end in that moment on the porch, but it entered a phase it couldn't escape: formal investigation, scrutiny of past conduct, and a real possibility that the badge wouldn't survive what the record revealed. Once the investigation opened, the department's priority wasn't just discipline, it was containment. They had to answer basic questions fast. Why Halverson went to that address, what he claimed he was investigating, and why he tried to push entry without a warrant. With the porch footage already circulating, any gap between his written narrative and what the cameras showed would make things worse. So the review widened. Supervisors in internal affairs pulled prior incidents tied to Halverson and looked for the same markers people had complained about for years. Intimidation language, threats framed as routine, vague justification for stops, and reports that leaned heavily on officer discretion while offering thin facts. That's where the pattern became hard to ignore. It wasn't one misunderstanding. It was repetition. Similar complaints, similar tactics, and similar outcomes. Except this time there was clean documentation and a homeowner with legal authority who couldn't be brushed aside. Community response shifted too. Residents who'd stayed quiet started filing their own complaints, not because they suddenly trusted the system, but because they saw something rare, a moment where evidence forced the system to respond. Some shared dates, badge numbers, and past interactions. Others offered to provide footage they'd kept but never thought would matter. And inside the department, the pressure wasn't just public. It was legal and procedural. A federal judge involved meant the department had to assume oversight would be serious, and that sloppy handling could turn a personnel issue into a much larger problem. Halverson's suspension stopped being the headline and became the beginning, an active investigation that threatened his certification, his position, and the department's credibility if they failed to act. By the end of that week, the message around Maplewood was clear and practical. Intimidation worked best in private, and it fell apart in public. After the suspension hit, the department tried to regain control of the narrative. They issued careful, generic statements about a review and policy compliance, the kind of language meant to calm the public without admitting fault. But the footage made that difficult because people didn't need interpretations anymore. They'd already seen the behavior. And once a department is forced into a review under public pressure, the next battle is always the same, whether it becomes a real investigation or a procedural cleanup. In Halverson's case, it leaned real. Investigators started checking what he had claimed that night against what could be verified. Calls, assignments, any documented narcotics operation connected to that address. The wrong house detail became central because it raised an uncomfortable possibility. He hadn't been following a real lead. He'd been following a habit. At the same time, the older complaints gained weight. People who'd been dismissed before now looked credible in hindsight because the porch footage showed a consistent style, forcing urgency, using threats to create compliance, then relying on the fact that most residents didn't have the time, money, or influence to fight back. Judge Whitaker didn't need to campaign against him. Her involvement did something stronger. It removed the department's ability to pretend the issue was unclear. Her calm refusal, the clear recordings, and the fact that she knew exactly what lawful procedure required made the contrast obvious. By the end of the process, Halverson's situation stopped being an officer who made a mistake and became an officer whose pattern finally got documented in a way that couldn't be explained away. And that was the long-term consequence. His career wasn't threatened by one confrontation alone. It was threatened because the confrontation exposed everything behind it. As the investigation moved forward, the story stopped being about one porch confrontation and turned into a department-wide test. Because now Internal Affairs wasn't just looking at what Halverson did that night. They were looking at whether supervisors had ignored warning signs, whether prior complaints had been dismissed too easily, and whether procedure had become something selectively enforced, depending on who was standing on the other side of the badge. That's why the review exposed more than Halverson's behavior. It exposed how predictable his behavior had become. Residents described the same approach over and over. Escalation first, paperwork later. Pressure to comply. then a report written to justify the pressure. And once those accounts lined up with the porch footage, the department couldn't treat them like isolated grievances anymore. Halverson tried the usual defenses, framing it as misunderstanding, claiming urgency, implying he was acting in good faith. But the recordings limited how far that could go. Multiple angles and clear audio meant the department couldn't interpret away the central issue. He demanded entry without a warrant and used intimidation to try to get it. So the consequences sharpened, his suspension held, the investigation expanded, and with it came the real career threat, findings that could lead to termination, decertification, and potential outside scrutiny if the department's handling looked like a cover-up. Meanwhile, in Maplewood, something changed that departments often underestimate. People started documenting more, not out of paranoia, but out of pattern recognition. The community had just watched proof do what complaints alone couldn't. The lesson wasn't, everyone is out to get you. The lesson was, if it happens, preserve it. And Judge Whitaker's role became a quiet example of how to handle power. She didn't scream, she didn't chase attention, and she didn't bend. She stayed calm, stayed inside the law, and let evidence carry the weight. That was the lasting impact. Halverson's intimidation only worked when it stayed private. The moment it became public, it started falling apart, piece by piece, complaint by complaint, until the system had no choice but to confront what it had been allowing. By the time the department finished pulling records, Maplewood understood what the porch incident really was. It wasn't a random mistake. It was a moment where a familiar tactic finally met three things intimidation couldn't beat: clear legal boundaries, multiple witnesses, and clean documentation. The department's internal review didn't just focus on that night. It forced leadership to confront what had been tolerated. An officer treating narcotics like a shortcut word, using threats to manufacture cooperation, and relying on the assumption that most people wouldn't be able to fight back. That assumption failed the second the cameras came out. Judge Alana Whitaker didn't win because she was louder. She won because she was precise. She didn't let the encounter drift into emotion or confusion. She kept it about one issue, no warrant, no entry, and let the recordings preserve everything else. And Halverson's retreat told the real truth. He wasn't confident in his legal footing. He was confident in people being too scared to challenge him. Once the footage spread, the complaints didn't feel like whispers anymore. They became a file, a pattern, a risk the department could no longer ignore without exposing itself. His suspension and investigation weren't just about punishing one officer. They were about the department trying to prove it wasn't the kind of place that protected behavior like that. The lesson that stuck with the community was practical, not dramatic. Procedure protects people, and evidence forces systems to act. So here's the question. If you were standing at that door, would you have known your rights well enough to stay calm? And if you were one of the neighbors, would you have recorded quietly, clearly, so the truth couldn't be rewritten later? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs the reminder that boundaries matter. And subscribe for more story times like this. Grounded, realistic, and focused on accountability.
Hey, what are you doing out here?
Sir, I'm headed to work.
Work at 4 in the morning? Where?
Moving job, about 20 miles from where I live.
20 miles on foot?
Yes, sir. I don't have a choice.
Look.
At 4:20 a.m., Officer Miles Raines slowed his patrol car and made the kind of choice that could go two ways fast. A young man was power walking along the shoulder of a main road. No sidewalk, no businesses open, no reason anyone should be out there unless something had gone wrong. He wasn't stumbling or wandering. He was moving like he was late for something that mattered. Raines didn't hit his lights right away. He paced him first, reading the situation the way cops were trained to. Direction, speed, hands, what was visible, what wasn't. His dash cam was already rolling. When he decided to make contact, his body camera came on too, because whatever happened next would need to be clean, documented, and defensible. He pulled up alongside and told the man to stop. The man stopped immediately. That alone threw Rains off balance. People who were guilty usually did one of two things. They ran or they overacted. This man did neither. He just stood there, breathing hard, sweat on his face, backpack on, hands visible, looking tired in a way that didn't feel performative. Rains questioned him. He pressed, because a person on foot at that hour could mean danger, someone else's danger or his own. He expected a story that didn't line up. He expected evasiveness. Instead, the man gave an answer that made Rains go quiet for a second. Not because it was dramatic, because it was specific. And it didn't match any of the usual reasons a stop like this happened. For a brief moment, you could practically see the officer's suspicion searching for somewhere to land and finding nothing. Whatever the man had just told him hit like an unexpected fact. The kind that forced Rains to reassess the entire situation right there on camera, while the road stayed empty and the morning stayed dark. And that was the moment everything shifted, because Rains realized this wasn't a man walking away from trouble. He was walking towards something he couldn't afford to lose. Where are you watching from? Country, state, city? Drop it in the comments. And if you like stories where someone stays calm under pressure and where accountability actually shows up in real life, hit like and subscribe, because this one didn't end on that roadside. That stop was just the beginning. To understand why Trey was out there in the first place, you had to understand what starting over meant to him. Trey had moved to Homewood, Alabama with his mother after they lost everything in Hurricane Katrina. That kind of loss didn't just erase possessions. It left a permanent fear of instability. Trey and his mom rebuilt carefully. No cushion, no extra. Just steady effort and the hope that life wouldn't reset them again. So when Trey landed a job with a moving company about 20 miles away, he treated it like more than employment. It was a lifeline, a chance to get ahead instead of surviving week to week. Then, on the morning he was supposed to start, his old car finally died. No warning that mattered. No easy fix. Just a dead vehicle and a start time that didn't care. Trey didn't have money for repairs. He didn't have money for a tow. And he didn't have the kind of situation where he could miss day one, apologize later, and assume people would understand. He knew how employers saw it. Unreliable before you even begin. So he made a decision that sounded extreme until you measured it against his reality. He set an alarm for midnight and started walking. Not for attention. Not to prove a point. Because the alternative felt like sliding back toward the edge he and his mom had been fighting to stay away from. As the night went on, the walk became exactly what you'd expect, exhausting. His legs burned. His pace slowed and sped up in waves. He kept checking the time, adjusting his effort, refusing to let his body decide for him. He wasn't walking for fitness. He was walking to keep his job, before he even had it. By the time he reached the stretch of road where Officer Rains found him, Trey had been on his feet for hours. He looked like someone who'd been pushing through pain for a reason he couldn't explain quickly without sounding unbelievable. And that was the problem. Because from the outside, alone, moving fast, backpack on, in the dark, Trey looked like the kind of suspicious that got people stopped. Rains followed because that was his job. He wasn't going to ignore a person moving like that at that hour and risk it turning into something worse later. But Trey wasn't thinking about how it looked. He was thinking about the clock, the job site, and what missing this opportunity would do to his life. So when Rains finally pulled up and made contact, it became a quiet chess game. Authority on one side, determination on the other. Rains controlled the scene with questions and presence. Trey controlled his own outcome by staying calm, staying clear, and not giving the situation anything it could twist into a different story. And then Trey explained why he was out there. He didn't dress it up. He didn't get emotional. He just told the truth, where he was headed, how far it was, and why turning back wasn't an option. That truth, simple, disciplined, and painfully real, was what shocked the officer. Because it meant the suspicious thing wasn't crime. It was commitment. And on camera, with the roadside quiet and the moment fully documented, Officer Rains had to decide what kind of person he was going to be next. Officer Rains kept the stop tight and procedural at first, because that was how you avoided problems later. He asked for Trey's name, where he was headed, and why he was out there at that hour. He kept his tone controlled and his distance consistent. He didn't escalate, but he also didn't relax. Trey answered the way someone answered when they couldn't afford to be misunderstood. He didn't argue the stop. He didn't act offended. He stayed focused on facts, where the job was, when he had to be there, and what had happened to his car. Rains tested the story without turning it into a scene. He asked follow-ups that would catch a lie if it existed. He looked at Trey's condition, sweat, fatigue, the way his legs kept subtly shifting like they were cramping. He looked at the phone map in Trey's hand. He looked at the direction of travel. And slowly, the suspicion ran out of places to hide. Because Trey wasn't giving the energy of somebody avoiding consequences. He was giving the energy of somebody chasing a deadline. There was a short pause where Rains clearly recalculated. His body cam was recording his face, his silence, the moment his assumptions met reality. That mattered. If he handled it wrong, it wouldn't just be a bad interaction. It would be documented by his own equipment, by dispatch logs, by any later review. So Rains made the decision that separated a routine stop from a turning point. He acknowledged the situation for what it was. Trey was exhausted, still miles away, and trying to make it to his first day of work. Then he offered a ride for the remaining distance. Trey hesitated, not because he didn't need it, but because accepting help from a patrol car at that hour came with its own weight. He understood how it could look. He understood how quickly people wrote their own stories about someone like him, but he also understood the bigger truth. This was about getting to work on time. So he got in. Rains kept it professional. He didn't turn it into a lecture. He didn't treat Trey like a suspect anymore, but he also didn't pretend the power imbalance hadn't been there. He drove, kept the route straightforward, and checked the time the same way Trey had been checking it all night. On the way, Trey gave the simple version of his life, enough to explain why this job mattered so much. He mentioned moving to Homewood with his mother after Katrina took everything. He mentioned how quickly things could fall apart when you didn't have savings, connections, or backup plans. He made it clear he wasn't looking for pity. He was trying to earn stability. Rains listened. And you could tell the story was landing on him in a way he didn't expect, because his questions shifted from suspicion to logistics. Where the job site was, what time Trey had to clock in, whether anyone there was expecting him. It was a small but important change. The officers stopped looking for wrongdoing and started looking for a solution. They pulled up near the job site with enough time to spare that Trey could actually breathe. Trey got out, thanked him, and moved with urgency toward the trucks and the early morning activity. Rains watched for a second before driving off. Not in a dramatic way, more like he wanted to confirm for himself that Trey was real, that the story ended where Trey said it would end. The body cam captured that too. The handoff from suspicion to trust. Trey reported in and got to work. No speech, no announcement. He did what movers did, showed up, listened, lifted, followed instructions. He didn't act like he had just walked through the night. He acted like he was determined not to lose the opportunity he'd fought to reach. That's when the homeowner noticed something wasn't adding up. The homeowner saw the exhaustion in Trey's face, the way he pushed through the work anyway, the way the crew reacted to him with a mix of disbelief and respect. Eventually, the explanation surfaced. Trey had walked for hours, been stopped by police, and still made it on time. The homeowner didn't treat it like gossip. They treated it like a story that needed to be told while it was still fresh, while it still meant something. They posted it on Facebook, focused on the determination, the timing, the officer's decision to help, and the fact that Trey had shown up when most people would have quit. And almost immediately, the post started moving. At first it was friends, then friends of friends, then people outside the neighborhood, outside the city, sharing it with the same reaction. Disbelief turning into respect. Trey was inside a house carrying boxes, trying to earn his first day like it was any other. Meanwhile, his life was starting to change online without him even touching his phone. The Facebook post didn't spread because it was polished. It spread because it was simple. A young man had done something most people couldn't imagine doing, and he'd done it for a reason people understood immediately. Within hours, the story was leaving Homewood. People shared it with short reactions, some amazed, some angry that anyone had to go that far, just to keep a job. Some focused on the officer's decision to help, instead of escalate. And as the shares climbed, so did the questions. People wanted proof. Not because they wanted to tear Trey down, but because the internet had trained them to doubt everything. So the conversation turned into accountability in real time. Commenters asked for confirmation, asked where it happened, asked if the moving company could verify he was scheduled that morning. The homeowner responded with what they had: timing, location, and the basic details of what they personally witnessed. The moving crew backed it up in their own circles. And the most important piece wasn't a dramatic video. It was that the story matched reality in ways that were hard to fake. The job site, the company trucks, the supervisor's confirmation, and the fact that Trey was still there, working instead of chasing attention online. That was when someone took the next step. A GoFundMe was created to help Trey get reliable transportation. The goal was modest at first, enough for repairs, enough for a used car, enough to keep him from ever having to make that walk again. Then the donations started coming in faster than anyone expected. $5, $10, $50. People who had never met Trey donated because the story hit a nerve. A person doing everything right and still getting one breakdown away from losing everything. As the total climbed past the goal, the tone shifted again. It stopped being just about help. It became about what kind of community people wanted to be. One that watched struggle as entertainment, or one that actually changed the outcome. Trey didn't even find out the full scale of it immediately. He was still focused on work, showing up the next day and the next, acting like the safest move was to stay consistent and let the noise pass. But the noise didn't pass. Local pages picked it up, then larger accounts. The same short summary kept circulating, and each time it did, more people asked the same question. Who was this guy, and why was he left with no option but to walk? That question reached the moving company in a way no internal report ever could. First, it hit managers. Then it hit someone higher. Eventually, it reached the CEO. And when it reached him, it didn't land as a feel-good post. It landed as a public test of the company's values. Because now thousands of strangers were watching what the company would do with the fact that their new hire had nearly walked a full marathon twice over, just to avoid missing day one. The CEO didn't treat it like a marketing moment right away. He verified it. He checked schedules. He confirmed the job site. He confirmed Trey's start date and clock in. He asked about performance, whether Trey had actually shown up ready to work, whether he had done the job without complaint, whether this was real. Every answer came back the same. Trey had earned his place the hard way, and nobody had handed him anything. So the CEO made a decision that was both personal and strategic. He was going to show up himself, not to send a message through an email, not to post a statement, to appear in front of Trey face to face and change the practical problem that started all of this. Because at that point, the story wasn't just about one walk. It was about whether the people with power, resources, and visibility would respond like human beings or like bystanders. The Facebook post kept spreading, and the GoFundMe didn't just meet its goal. It blew past it fast. As more people shared it, the moving company's name got pulled into the spotlight. And the question became simple. What would the company do now that everyone was watching? The story reached the CIO. He didn't just react online. He verified the basics, then showed up in person. Trey was still working, still trying to keep his life normal. When the CEO spoke with him, Trey confirmed what happened in the same practical way he'd been doing from the start. The car died. He couldn't miss day one, so he walked. Then the CEO solved the core problem. He gave Trey a car. That moment spread too, and it sparked the phrase people started repeating everywhere. Be like Trey. Not meaning walk 20 miles, but meaning show up, stay disciplined, and do the right thing even when it's hard. Trey didn't become a celebrity in his own life. He kept working. He used the support to stabilize things at home with his mom. The attention was overwhelming, but the outcome was practical. Transportation meant he could keep the job without risking another crisis. And quietly, the incident became a reference point, something people brought up later when they talked about dignity, assumptions, and what it looked like when a community decided to help a person who was already helping himself. In the end, that night didn't change Trey because he became famous. It changed him because one impossible choice led to a chain of reasonable help at the exact moment it mattered. So, here's the question for you. If you saw someone pushing through like that, would you assume the worst? Or would you pause long enough to learn the truth? Drop your thoughts in the comments and share the story with someone who needs the reminder that showing up still matters. And if you want more story times like this, realistic, grounded, and focused on accountability, make sure you subscribe.
All right, sir, who are you and what exactly are you doing out here?
My name is Darnell Price. I'm a federal instructor. I'm scheduled to teach a session in this. I have a scheduled meeting in that building. Dispatch can verify. There's a verification line.
Oh, it looks convincing, but something about this doesn't feel right.
You don't have to take my word for it. Call it in.
Officer Brandon Hale told Darnell Price that if the federal credential was fake, Darnell could be arrested right there. They were in a quiet office park parking lot, close enough to the front entrance that people walking in could see everything. Hale stood in Darnell's path and ordered him to stay where he was and keep his hands visible. He asked for identification immediately, and his tone made it clear he wasn't treating this like a casual question. Darnell didn't argue. He didn't talk back. He moved carefully and slowly, got his wallet out, and handed over his driver's license. Then he presented the federal credential that had been visible on him from a distance. Darnell explained calmly and clearly that he was an authorized federal instructor and had a scheduled meeting inside the contractor office. He also explained how to confirm it the correct way. Dispatch could verify him through official systems, and the credential had verification information for that purpose. Hale didn't try to verify it first. He looked over the credential and said it appeared convincing but seemed wrong to him. Then he used his radio and reported Darnell as a suspicious person with a possibly fake federal ID. He requested backup. That radio call changed the situation fast. People nearby started paying attention because the stop didn't match what they were seeing. Darnell was dressed for work, standing still, answering calmly, and offering an easy way to confirm everything. Hale was treating it like a high-risk contact anyway. A couple employees slowed down as they walked from their cars. One of them stopped entirely and watched. Another held a phone in their hand, not making a scene, just ready in case things got worse. The stop was happening in the open, and everyone could feel the tension rising even though Darnell hadn't done anything aggressive. Darnell stayed steady. He kept his hands visible. He repeated the same basics without adding extra details. He was there for a scheduled meeting, he had valid ID, and dispatch could confirm it quickly. He didn't try to debate Hale. He kept pushing the interaction back toward the simplest solution: verification. Hale kept it framed as suspicion. He treated Darnell's calm confidence like it meant Darnell was trying to get away with something. He kept holding onto the credential as if it needed to be proven real by Darnell, even though Darnell had already given him the method to confirm it officially. Backup was on the way. And once other officers arrived, what should have been a quick check was about to become a full public stop, recorded on Bodycam, watched by employees, and impossible to explain away later if the facts didn't support Hale's suspicion. The first backup car pulled in and stopped a short distance away. A second arrived right after. Two more officers stepped out and looked from Hale to Darnell, trying to understand why they'd been called. Darnell stayed where he was. His hands were still visible. He didn't change his tone or his posture. He looked like someone who had been interrupted on the way to work and was waiting for a process to finish. Hale gave the quick version of his concern. He said the federal credential looked real but didn't feel right to him. He said Darnell's explanation sounded too practiced. He made it clear he wanted the stop handled his way, and he kept the credential in his hand while he talked. One of the backup officers, Marisol Chen, didn't match Hale's intensity. She looked at Darnell's clothes, the laptop bag, the folder, and the fact that Darnell had already provided a driver's license and the credential. Then she looked at Hale and asked what verification steps had been taken so far. Hale's answer was basically that he didn't trust it yet. Chen asked why dispatch wasn't the first step. She kept it practical. If there was a question about the credential, dispatch could confirm it. If there was a question about the meeting, the contractor office could confirm it. The building was right there. Hale pushed back. He insisted on keeping Darnell in place until he felt satisfied. He treated Darnell's calmness like it was another reason to be suspicious instead of a reason to relax. At that point, more people were watching. A few employees were standing near their cars, pretending they weren't paying attention, but they were. Someone near the entrance had their phone out. Nobody was yelling. Nobody was interfering. They were just paying attention because the stop had turned into something bigger than it needed to be. Darnell spoke only to keep things clear. He repeated that he was a federal instructor, there for his scheduled meeting, and that everything could be verified through dispatch and the credentials verification information. He didn't insult Hale. He didn't threaten to complain. He didn't escalate. He stayed focused on verification. Chen and another officer exchanged a quick look, the kind of look that said they didn't like where this was going, not because Darnell was a threat, but because Hale had already turned a simple check into a situation with witnesses, body cam footage, and unnecessary tension. Then dispatch came back over the radio. The message was direct. The credential was legitimate, and Darnell Price was confirmed as an authorized federal instructor. The verification matched. The effect was immediate. The backup officers visibly relaxed because the risk they'd been called in for wasn't real. The only real problem left was what had already happened in public. Hale had no room left to keep the possibly fake framing. He handed Darnell's ID and credential back and tried to end the stop quickly. Darnell didn't celebrate. He didn't lecture. He simply took his documents, restated that verification was available from the beginning, and walked toward the contractor building for his meeting, still calm, still controlled, as if he refused to give the situation anything extra to feed on. And behind him, multiple cameras had captured the whole thing. How fast Hale assumed, how long he delayed verification, and how different the stop looked once the facts couldn't be ignored. Darnell walked into the contractor building like he still had a job to do, because he did. Inside, the air felt different than the parking lot. Quiet, controlled, people speaking in low voices. At the reception desk, he gave his name and the meeting contact. The receptionist recognized the appointment immediately. A manager came out to meet him, and Darnell was escorted back the same way any scheduled instructor would be. But the stop had followed him in. Two employees in a hallway gave him a quick look that said they'd either seen it themselves or heard about it already. Someone asked if he was okay. Darnell kept it short and professional. He didn't tell a long story. He didn't try to rally people. He just said it had been handled and he was there for the scheduled session. That choice mattered. Darnell didn't let the stop become his personality for the day. He focused on the work in front of him. Still, the building had its own internal network. By lunch, several people knew a local officer had stopped a federal instructor in the lot called backup, and then had to back off when dispatch confirmed everything was legitimate. A few people had recorded parts of it from a distance. Others had just watched long enough to feel uncomfortable. And unlike a street corner, an office park had names and departments attached to everything. One employee forwarded a short clip to a coworker. A coworker sent it to a supervisor. A supervisor asked building security what they knew. Security didn't have to guess. The lot had cameras, the lobby had cameras, the officers had body cams. The event wasn't rumor-based, it was documented from multiple angles. By the end of the day, the contractor's security manager had filed an internal incident note, not because a crime happened, but because an unnecessary escalation happened on their property involving a verified visitor. That kind of incident created risk for them, even if it didn't make the news. Darnell finished his scheduled work and left on time. He didn't take a victory lap through the parking lot. He didn't look for Hale. He drove off, got back to his routine, and handled it the way he handled everything else, documented, factual, and calm. Later that evening, he wrote down the basics while they were still fresh: time, location, patrol car numbers he remembered, and the sequence. Stopped first, verification offered immediately, backup requested anyway, confirmation delayed until dispatch forced it. He also emailed his federal point of contact and explained what happened in plain language. Not emotional, not dramatic, just a record. He attached the meeting confirmation and noted that the credential had been verified by dispatch during the stop. That message did two things. First, it protected Darnell if anyone tried to twist the story later. Second, it triggered the kind of attention that local departments didn't like. Formal questions from an outside agency about why one of their officers treated a verified credential as fake before doing the basic check. Within a few days, Hale's department had the footage pulled. This wasn't a viral outrage situation yet. It didn't need to be. Departments reviewed Bodycam for smaller issues all the time: use of force, complaints, policy questions, stops that created risk. And this stop had multiple red flags that stood out even without anyone raising their voice. The timeline looked bad. The radio call labeled Darnell as suspicious with a possibly fake federal ID before any real verification was attempted. The stop escalated to backup, while Darnell remained cooperative and offered a clear path to confirmation. In the moment dispatch confirmed legitimacy, the whole basis for the stop disappeared instantly. That was the problem. The facts were available early, but the decision-making didn't match the facts. A supervisor watched the footage more than once. Another pulled the call logs. A third checked whether Hale had run the verification steps the way he was trained to do. The review wasn't about whether Hale was allowed to ask questions. It was about why he chose the most confrontational path when a simple confirmation was right there. Hale was asked to explain his choices. His explanation didn't land the way he thought it would. Saying he had a bad feeling didn't carry weight next to video of a cooperative, professionally dressed visitor offering verification from the start. Saying the credential seemed off wasn't enough when the credential was confirmed legitimate, and Hale never tried the basic verification first. The department didn't need a headline to see the liability. All they needed was the footage, and the contractor didn't stay silent either. Their leadership didn't want their employees watching unnecessary police escalations outside their front door. It created tension, fear, and legal exposure. They asked for a meeting with the department's community liaison and requested clearer procedures for contacts involving verified visitors on their property. Darnell didn't become a public face overnight. He didn't go online trying to build a moment. He kept it formal and focused. Documentation, follow-up, and making sure the record matched reality. Because he understood something Hale didn't seem to understand in that parking lot. When everything is recorded, confidence isn't a bluff. It's just what truth looks like when it doesn't panic. Within 2 weeks, the stop had moved from something awkward that happened in a parking lot to a documented issue with names, timestamps, and policy questions attached to it. The contractor's security team pulled their lot footage and saved it with the time markers. Their leadership didn't treat it like gossip. They treated it like risk management. An incident involving a verified visitor, multiple officers, and employees recording outside the front entrance was the kind of thing that could turn into a complaint, a lawsuit, or a workforce problem if it happened again. They asked the police department for a formal review and requested a point of contact, not to attack the department, but to make it clear they expected future contacts on their property to be handled with verification first, not escalation first. At the department, Hale's body cam was reviewed along with the radio traffic and dispatch logs. The review focused on decisions, not just tone. The key issue was simple. Hale treated the credential as fake before using the verification process that existed to answer that exact question. He asked for backup, while Darnell remained cooperative and provided the fastest path to confirmation. And he used possibly fake federal ID language over the radio without having done basic checks first. When supervisors watched the footage, they didn't just see a stop. They saw avoidable exposure. Hale was pulled into meetings with the supervisor and internal review staff. He was asked to explain why he escalated without verifying first, why he described the situation the way he did on the radio, and why he kept control of the stop even when backup officers questioned the approach. The outcome wasn't a dramatic public firing. It was more realistic than that. Hale was placed on a corrective track, documented counseling, mandatory retraining on identification verification, and suspicious person stops, and a warning tied to future stops. The message was that he could not rely on instinct alone when a quick confirmation was available, and he could not turn a cooperative contact into a high-tension scene because he didn't like being corrected by facts. The department also sent a short internal reminder to patrol. When a credential is unfamiliar, verify it through dispatch first. Keep radio descriptions accurate and limited to observable facts. Avoid language that escalates a scene without cause. And remember that body cam and bystander video will show whether the officer chose the least risky option. On the contractor side, procedures changed too. Security began meeting certain visitors at the door, instead of letting them cross the lot alone if they were arriving with credentials that local officers might not recognize. Reception was instructed to confirm scheduled federal visitors quickly if an officer called. Managers were told to document police contacts on the property even when no arrest or citation happened, because the almost incidents were the ones that created patterns. Darnell handled it the same way he handled the stop: formal, factual, controlled. He didn't post a rant. He didn't chase attention. He kept a record, followed his agency's reporting process, and responded when asked for details. When the department's liaison reached out, Darnell agreed to provide his timeline and verification steps again, because he wanted the next person to have a safer experience than he did. A month later, the difference showed up in small ways. Darnell returned to a similar contractor site for work, and the arrival process was smoother. Security expected him. The meeting contact was ready. And when a local officer drove through the lot and glanced over, nothing happened, because the system around the visit was tighter. The body cam footage ended up doing what arguments never could. It showed the early moment when verification was offered. It showed the choice to escalate anyway. And it showed the instant shift when dispatch confirmed legitimacy, how quickly the suspicious framing collapsed the moment facts were undeniable. That footage became a teaching example inside the department, even if no one publicly admitted it. Not because it was sensational, but because it was common. An officer made assumptions, delayed verification, and created a public problem that didn't need to exist. And Darnell didn't need to win a confrontation to get accountability. He just needed to stay professional long enough for the record to speak. Darnell didn't talk about that parking lot like it was a victory. When people at the contractor office asked him about it later, he kept it simple. He'd been stopped, he'd been verified, and he'd gone to work. He didn't add heat to it because he didn't need to. The documentation already had all the heat anyone could want. What stayed with him wasn't the questions. It was the order of operations. Hale had treated suspicion like a reason to escalate first and verify later. And that order mattered. because it turned a normal professional arrival into something that could have gotten dangerous if Darnell had reacted differently, if a backup officer had shown up more keyed up, or if a bystander had tried to help in the wrong way. Darnell understood that in moments like that, you couldn't control someone else's assumptions, but you could control what you gave the record. So he kept doing what worked. He stayed still and visible. He used short, clear answers. He offered verification through the official channel, not through persuasion. He documented afterward while details were fresh. And because he did, the story didn't end in the parking lot. It ended in policy conversations and retraining and quiet changes that reduced the chances of it happening again. For Hale, it was the kind of incident that followed an officer longer than they expected, not because the public made a spectacle of it, but because the footage showed decision-making. Supervisors could point to it and say, "This is what we're not doing anymore." You don't get to label someone possibly fake on the radio when you haven't used the tools designed to answer the question. You don't get to treat a calm professional like they're a threat just because they're calm. For the contractor, it was a reminder that safe environments still needed procedures. They couldn't assume everyone would be treated normally just because the buildings were clean and the parking lots were quiet. They tightened arrival protocols, improved coordination with dispatch and local patrol, and made sure visitors didn't have to rely on luck to be treated like they belonged. And for the employees who watched that day, it did something you can't undo. It taught them how fast a normal moment could turn into a public problem, and how important it was that someone had recorded it, because that was the real accountability in the story. Not a speech, not a viral headline, just a clean timeline, captured on Bodycam and phones, showing that the truth was available early and ignored until it couldn't be. Now here's the question for you. If you were standing there watching, would you have recorded? Would you have walked past and told yourself it was none of your business? Or would you have stayed close enough to make sure the moment couldn't be rewritten later? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you've ever had a verification should have been enough situation happen to you, or someone you know, share what it looked like. And if you want more realistic story times where calm, documentation, and procedure lead to real consequences, make sure you like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.